Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me?
Yes, I've got them on mute, so they can.
Okay, great, good. Yeah, thank you, Tom, and thank you also to Paul Bender-Samuel, with whom I initially connected when I was at Oxford last year. The OCMS building, the church, is right next to the Latin American Center, and it was the pandemic. I was arriving in the middle of the pandemic, and everything looked very closed. So I was very glad that towards the end of my stay, in the beginning of the summer term, things started to open up, and I was able to use the library there. In fact, a couple of the books that I used for the paper I'm going to present, I consulted at the library there, and also to meet Paul, have coffee, and talk about our mutual interest in the Summer Institute of Linguistics and Wycliffe Bible Translators. So I'm going to present a paper which I will be very happy to share with you. It's actually online at the website you see in the bottom left of the screen, where I have a lot of my academic work posted. Probably some of you have already read the paper, so this won't be terribly new to you, and in which case I look forward to your questions and observations. I find that as I was rereading the paper last night, I was questioning some of my own findings. So I do welcome questions and doubts as to my doubts over my reasoning. This is something of a new field, that is a quantitative approach to mission activity. So I do appreciate all kinds of feedback. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read excerpts from the paper and talk through some of the slides where I engage in the statistics. In 1935, two American Protestant missionaries took up residence in distinct indigenous Mexican towns in the states of Morelos and Oaxaca, and they began learning the vernacular languages, Nahuatl and Mixtec. These men were William Cameron Townsend, founder of newly minted organization, the Summer Institute of Linguistics, and veteran of the Guatemalan mission field, and Kenneth Pike, a recent college graduate with an unusual gift for languages. Their aim was to become sufficiently proficient in the local dialects to be able to translate into them the New Testament, for they believed that only through direct access to God's word could indigenous souls be saved. Their endeavors were unusual for three reasons. Prior to Townsend, although there had been occasional translations of scripture into indigenous languages, few, if any, Protestant missionaries in the Americas had combined long-term residence in the field with a commitment to rendering the gospel into a local tongue. Second, what began in Mexico in 1935 blossomed into what is today arguably the world's biggest missionary organization, Wycliffe Bible Translators, or as it now calls itself, the Wycliffe Global Alliance. Third, what gave SIL, the Summer Institute of Linguistics, much of its initial impetus and logistical aid was the decidedly secular government of Mexico, headed by the socialist Lázaro Cárdenas. President Cárdenas viewed Townsend's work as coinciding with several key goals of the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920 and the post-revolutionary policy of indigenismo, that is, a federal plan to integrate native peoples into the larger nation by teaching them literacy, Spanish, and good citizenship, and by weaning them from what they considered oppressive influence of caciques, that is, authoritarian community bosses, and the Catholic Church. Cárdenas gave SIL a lot of material and political support. While the Mexican government was somewhat less supportive during the 1940s, in 1951, state support rebounded with a formal accord between SIL and the Public Education Ministry. By its terms, SIL would spearhead educational outreach to indigenous Mexicans, and the state would distribute its translated materials. And while they were producing these texts, SIL's missionary linguists would work on their main translation task, bilingual New Testaments. This story is well documented, initially by SIL and Wycliffe itself, later by anthropologists, and more recently by historians. Indeed, scholars have long recognized the importance of SIL to Protestant evangelism, also to indigenous education and rural community transformation in Mexico. Yet in none of the three kinds of literature, that is, memoirs by SIL veterans, studies by anthropologists, and more recently historians, has a sustained attempt been made to quantify the influence of SIL upon the communities in which its missionaries lived and worked. The purpose of this paper, therefore, is to use Mexican census data to gauge as much as possible the impact of SIL on local level literacy, also on Spanish acquisition and on material change. This is a longitudinal quantitative study, starting with the census of 1940 and ending with that of 1970, after which factors including the burgeoning presence of Pentecostals, including in places where SIL was active, complicate the statistical picture. Analysis of census figures is complemented by perusal of the existing literature, including the memoirs I mentioned, linguistic materials digitized by SIL, and assistance from the SIL Mexico archive in Arizona. Here we have the main findings of the paper. Firstly, the census data suggests that the continuous presence of SIL staff in indigenous communities did help literacy grow faster between 1940 and 1970 than in indigenous communities without a permanent SIL presence. On average, the difference was modest, but it did improve the literacy growth rate by about 30% on average. Secondly, this faster literacy growth rate may have been achieved in coincidence or in synergy with federal and provincial school building programs. That is, schools may have been built more frequently in those locales, either by chance or, I think more likely, given SIL's preparation of indigenous literacy materials, by design. Further qualitative research is needed to either establish or discard a trend and correlation. Thirdly, census and other data suggest that contrary to Townsend's claim to Cardenas that indigenous language literacy would facilitate Spanish language acquisition, and despite its publication of many bilingual teaching materials, SIL was not a significant driver of bilingualism. Road building, as indigenous villages came to be connected to market towns, was likely a much bigger driver, probably followed by radio. And fourthly, census data suggests that SIL fostered relatively rapid conversion to Protestantism. That is, at rates typically far above the average for the states in which they operated. Other sources indicate that this was sometimes achieved in synergy, sometimes in parallel with existing evangelists or evangelists that arrived shortly afterwards, such as Presbyterian pastors in Chiapas. Some further findings, which I'll mention briefly, claims that conversion to Protestantism augmented savings and thus brought about material benefits as converts ceased to help pay for lengthy religious festivals and abstained from alcohol. While these claims are abundant in missionary accounts and also affirmed by anthropologists, they are hard to substantiate from the census data. I do so a little towards the end of the paper, but I'm not entirely convinced by what I found. Secondly, the 1970 census, here's something that I was not aiming to investigate, but became apparent as I crunched the numbers. The 1970 census, which purports to show a slowdown in the growth of Protestantism that sits at odds with local accounts, contains anomalous data that, together with these accounts, suggests the start of a deliberate mismeasurement of Mexican Protestants. Underestimation of their numbers may well have persisted in subsequent censuses, including that of 2020, the most recent census. And finally, the most cited negative tangible consequence of SIL's presence, the expulsion of Protestant converts from their communities, is occasionally apparent in the census data, especially in 1970, and in particular for the communities in the state of Chiapas, which since 1970 has been the state of Mexico with the highest proportion of Protestants. Today, it's roughly 40%. The rest of the paper proceeds as follows. The second section summarizes the origins and the purpose and practice, the modus operandi of SIL, first in Guatemala and then in Mexico. The third section reviews the literature on SIL, various kinds of writings on SIL. The fourth section describes my methodology, and finally I present the data. So that's how we're going to proceed. Here I'm going to abbreviate substantially. I'm not going to get into what went on in Guatemala in the 1920s, which is where Townsend forged his strategy of converting or translating the New Testament into an indigenous language. But essentially, he would seek to replicate that, but en masse in Mexico by hiring or recruiting many other Spanish proficient students from the United States. The Summer Institute of Linguistics was so called because it gave preliminary linguistics training to American would-be missionaries at summer camps held in the United States. These recruits were mostly recent university graduates, and in the autumn they would be assigned, usually in pairs, to an indigenous language community in Mexico. It was generally up to them to find a particular town in which they were welcome, which in a few cases took several years. Once settled, they would live there for anywhere from a few years to 50, learning the language, producing various kinds of translations, and evangelizing one-on-one. However, they did not found churches or hold services, preferring to work alongside other proselytizers, usually Mexicans, sometimes of their own training. In Chiapas, Oaxaca, and the Yucatan, states in the south of Mexico, for example, the churches whose faithful they helped to cultivate were mostly led by Mexican Presbyterians. Townsend chose Mexico as the first and for 10 years the only destination for SIL for 3 reasons. And here I'm going to present a timeline of activity in Mexico by SIL and Protestants more generally. Firstly, towards the end of his 15 years in Guatemala, where he pioneered the translation of the New Testament into Cachiquel, as a means to evangelizing the community in which a missionary lived, the entrepreneurial Townsend was anxious to take his approach to a grander territory. Second, shortly before leaving for the United States in 1932, he was invited to Mexico by Education Secretary Moises Sainz, an invitation he took up 3 years later. Sainz was himself a Presbyterian, and he was visiting Guatemala at the time. And thirdly, soon after Townsend and his wife had settled in Morelos, Mexico in late 1935 and begun to learn Nahuatl, President Cardenas himself heard of this project and visited him. Cardenas warmed to Townsend's work as an educator and also to him as a person. They developed a friendship which went on for decades. Townsend became Cardenas's official English language biographer, which is the book that I showed earlier here in the middle of the screen. What to Townsend was a soul-saving mission, to Cardenas was a literacy project, concordant with the goals of the revolution. It promised to help Mexico's overwhelmingly illiterate and non-Spanish speaking indigenous population learn to read and thereafter to acquire Spanish, crucial steps, he felt, to their becoming fully integrated Mexican citizens. In Mexico, here I'm going to talk about the modus operandi. In Mexico, SIL staff undertook their work as follows. First, they learned the vernacular language, Nahuatl or Mixtec, by interacting with the locals, and that could take 2 or 3 years to become conversationally proficient. Second, as they did so, since most of Mexico's indigenous languages were unwritten, they developed an orthography, a way of rendering that language into writing. Thirdly, they then compiled bilingual vernacular Spanish dictionaries, followed by grammars and primers, to aid in the teaching of vernacular literacy to the broader language group. And such materials were used both by themselves as informal teachers and also later in Mexican federal schools, as of the pact I mentioned earlier of 1951. Fourthly, in most cases, especially in the 1940s and 50s, they submitted articles to academic journals, thereby sharing their work and also building SIL's reputation as a scientific institution. A few members even went on to gain doctorates. Fifthly, as of 1951, they also translated at the Public Education Ministry's request such documents as the National Anthem, the Constitution, certain laws, booklets about hygiene, and agricultural training manuals. And finally, over the course of anywhere from 15 to 35 years, they worked on translations of the New Testament. And in other words, it took them, the quickest ones were completed in about 15 years, and the ones that took longest about 35 years. They usually started with standalone versions of the Gospel of Mark, which, as I'm sure you all know, is the shortest gospel. As Townsend had done in Guatemala, these texts, these translations of the New Testament, included the text in Spanish on a facing page. This conforming to Townsend's belief that vernacular literacy was the key to teaching and learning in Spanish, but also to his awareness that including Spanish made the publications more acceptable to Mexican and other Latin American governments. So altogether, these SIL missionary linguists were somewhat like the publication ministry teachers that was sent out from Mexico City by President Cardenas in the 1930s. There was this famous rural education project undertaken by Cardenas to recruit urban teachers and send them out almost as though they were missionaries themselves into the countryside to educate the illiterate rural population. And as they did so, and as SIL missionary linguists did so, they infused their primers with messages about good citizenship. They taught healthcare, they introduced new farming techniques, and sometimes they acted as interlocutors with federal and state agencies, for example, concerning the land redistribution program. They brought medicines, including the wonder of antibiotics. Some male linguists were married to registered nurses, and where single women were assigned in pairs, which happened quite often, one of them would have medical training. So that's the modus operandi of SIL in Mexico for much of the middle decades of the 20th century. So I now turn to the literature on SIL, and I basically categorize the literature into three parts, as I mentioned earlier. First to emerge were memoirs and accounts written by SIL members of the progress that SIL, or the Instituto Lingüístico del Verano, as it's called in Spanish, made in Mexico. The first of these, or the first major study to come out, was called 2000 Tongues to Go in 1959. And between the 1950s and right up to the present, these are some of the earliest books to come out, either about Townsend's project by sympathizers. I don't think James Heffley was a member of SIL, or by veteran missionaries. Mariana Slocum's book, The Good Seed, which came out in the 80s, has been much cited by anthropologists and historians. So the thing about these books is that while, of course, they are written with a missionary vision to social scientists, they are very useful for the raw data that they contain. Everything from when certain missionaries came to a particular town in the year in which they arrived, to their interactions with other Christians, other pastors, to their successes both as evangelists and as translators. That latter work, of course, has to be or should be, I think, compared with the census data. Sometimes we're going to see anomalies where what is in one of these books is not present in the census data, and I'm going to talk about that issue later on in the paper, what I believe to be evidence of suppression of conversion numbers. So this is the first, what we might call the first body of literature. It was the first to emerge, and it persists today. Privately published memoirs by SIL veterans continue to appear, or have done so in the last decade or so. Now, initially, Mexico's anthropological community was quite supportive of Townsend, because this policy of indigenismo that I mentioned, which arose in the 1920s and 30s in Mexico, was designed and very much supported by the anthropological community at the time in Mexico to bring indigenous peoples into the Mexican nation. But anthropology, not only in Mexico, but elsewhere, underwent a sea change in the 1960s. Values of cultural relativism, the idea that indigenous people should be appreciated on their and their culture should be appreciated on its own grounds. This idea of incorporating them into the nation, encouraging or even forcing them to become Spanish speakers was misguided. If they want to stay speaking Nahuatl and not interacting with the outside world, that's their right. And as an extension of that argument, anthropologists, the anthropological community, as of the mid-60s, we begin to see this change, and it's really solidified as of the 1970s. The majority of Mexican anthropologists by the 1970s, and also Americans and other foreigners doing research in Mexico, are arguing that missionaries are cultural imperialists, possibly even fronting for the CIA. That was a common rumor that emerged in the 1970s. Is God an American, which was edited by a couple of Danish anthropologists, I think they're from Denmark, was one of the first books to specifically critique the work of the Sum Institute of Linguistics. That came out in 1981, I think. And then famously, David Stoll's Fishers of Men or Founders of Empire, which looked at their activities. Actually, both of these books look at SIL's activities in Latin America as a whole. In the last, I would say in the last 20 years, since roughly 2000, there has been a kind of a move away from what we might call activist anthropology. Anthropologists working on Mexico in the last 20 years have been more willing to consider converts to Protestantism as exercising agency in doing so. They're not merely dupes or victims of cultural imperialism. They are willingly engaging for a variety of motives with Protestant pastors and choosing entirely of their own volition to convert, again, for a variety of reasons. And that kind of approach to the question of Protestantism in Mexico has become, I think, fairly common, if not the standard approach within anthropology in the last 20 years, at least in Mexico. And in tandem with that shift, we have historians entering the field. As of 2005, I think was the date of Missionaries of the State, 2006, A New Vision for Missions. These two books almost came out in parallel, both published by the same press, University of Alabama, and they take quite a neutral, perhaps somewhat sympathetic, but analytically rigorous, and I would say for the most part, objective approach to historicizing, to placing Townsend and SIL in a historical context and discussing the evolution of SIL's work in Mexico. Well, the second book rather focuses more on Guatemala than Mexico. It gives Mexico rather short shrift, in fact. But they're both very good books. And then more recently, Boone Aldridge, he is, I believe he's an SIL or Wycliffe veteran. I think he's done a number of books on the activities of Wycliffe over the years, but he also studied, I think he did a doctorate in history in St Andrews in Scotland, and this book is based on his doctorate, and again is a rigorous historical account of Wycliffe's activities chiefly in Mexico. So here we have the three bodies of literature, all of which were very useful for the putting together of my paper, but none of which engage in any kind of statistical analysis beyond occasional citing of population data or numbers of converts. There's no actual statistical analysis in any of these three bodies of literature. So that was my point of departure, the idea of looking at census data. I later found out that I was not the only one, that Bob Woodbury at Baylor is also engaged in a similar project, a much wider ranging project in terms of its chronology. And he's starting with the census of 1795 to look at religious conversion over more than 2 centuries. But I was not aware until after I finished my paper last summer that Bob was working on this. So we've talked about it, and I get the impression that I'll probably be publishing before he does, which he says is fine by him, because he doesn't get into the question of so much of the question of the literature, the historiography. So he said to me, it'd be very useful to have your paper once it's published to refer to for my own work, which is very kind to say that. So moving on from the literature to my method. I can say more about the books in the Q&A if you'd like. I have a number of things to say, for example, about the partiality of the anthropological accounts, which is quite striking. It's very anti-American in its language in many places. So my main research question was to test this hypothesis, which is not only advocated historically by SIL, but also by Mexico's educational authorities for several decades, that conversion to Protestantism from the syncretic form of Catholicism that's typically practiced in Mexico in indigenous communities, along with adherence to SIL's educational program, brought measurable benefits. And those benefits, many of which have been attested to by anthropologists as well, although they also express many reservations, are as follows: high or higher rates of literacy, greater Spanish language acquisition, improved savings as a result of ceasing to participate in what is known in Mexico as the cargo system, whereby nominated men in a particular community take turns to finance and organize lengthy religious festivals, usually attached to a town's saint's day. Ceasing to buy candles and fireworks and other items used in Catholic devotion, and also abstaining from alcohol. I do look somewhat at this third category in my paper. It's a little hard to get into, to separate the variables. There are other reported benefits which I don't even attempt to get into because they're too hard to quantify from the data I have. Improved health. I suppose one could gauge life expectancy from the census data. It would involve an awful amount of number crunching, which I don't have time for, I'm afraid, but it's something I suppose could be done by someone who is more statistically savvy than I am. Enhanced economic mobility. Again, it's hard to quantify from the data. It would logically follow from the third thesis, that of improved savings, and also perhaps due to the influence of pastors, Americans or American trained, who are advocates of small-scale entrepreneurialism, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And finally, fewer incidences of domestic violence. This is frequently attached in the literature to.
I did not participate.
I'm sorry. Should we save questions to the end?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Fewer incidences of domestic violence this trend is generally attached to abstaining from alcohol in highly patriarchal communities in Mexico, indigenous communities being traditionally, for the most part, not always, highly patriarchal. That sort of combination of male dominance and a propensity to drunkenness has tended to produce high levels of wife beating, frankly. Unfortunately, there are no data on that for this period. Data on domestic violence in Mexico, I think, began to be compiled in the 1990s, which is beyond the purview of this paper. Of course, there are also costs attached to conversion and to the presence of SIL. Perhaps the best known is population loss due to expulsion or migration of converts, famously in the case of the highlands of Chiapas, as of the 1960s, has been much documented, and which I witnessed myself in the 1990s. In fact, my own personal interest in this subject partly owes to my former experience as a journalist. Before I became a historian, I was a journalist in Mexico in the 1990s. And one of my first reporting assignments was to go to Chiapas to report on Protestant converts who had been expelled from the town of San Juan Chamula in the Chiapas highlands. This is just before the Zapatista rebellion, and so I saw for myself that this was a problem. Other reported costs to or costs of conversion and or of SIL's presence in indigenous communities, which I do not go into this study, but I'm just going to mention them in passing. I don't go into them because they are hard to quantify from statistical data. Incidents of violence between converts and Catholics. There is data on such violence in the National Archives reports to federal authorities. A book that came out a year or two ago, In the Vortex of Violence, on the subject of lynching in Mexico, has a whole chapter on the lynching of Protestants and Protestant pastors, which became quite a marked tendency as of 1944, when the Catholic Archbishop of Mexico City issued a pastoral letter in which he referred to the he basically referred to Protestants as snakes, and this kind of language was repeated by other Episcopal authorities across the country, and I think fueled anti-Protestant persecution. Decline in religious festivals. This is something that anthropologists have very much looked at, but I'm not sure how much it's been quantified or how it can be quantified. Again, the social cost of what has been termed family rupture, as some members of a family or of an extended family turn to Protestantism and others remain Catholic. This is something, again, that has preoccupied or has concerned, rather, anthropologists. And finally, the critique of SIL that it exaggerated differences between indigenous dialects, different forms of Mixtec, for example, spoken in different parts of Oaxaca, so to hinder, quote, political liberation movements of ethnic minorities. We can get into that later if you'd like. But again, I don't discuss that in this paper. The periodization is 1940 to 1970. As I mentioned earlier, Cameron Townsend and his wife Elvira settled in Morelos in 1935. Within 3 years, the number of SIL linguists in Mexico had grown to 26, divided in 13 communities working on 13 different languages or dialects. As you can see from the chart on the left, the longer that SIL spends in Mexico, the greater the proportion of linguists to languages studied grows. And that's because as of the mid-1940s, 1945 is particularly noticeable, you have a growing number of support staff based in Mexico City initially, later in Hidalgo and Oaxaca, who are basically lending logistical support and other kinds of support to those who are in the field. So that's why that sort of 2-to-1 ratio diminishes over time. I chose the 1940 census as a starting point because I felt that to compare 1930 with 1940 would not produce much fruit. In other words, missionaries were only just getting going. As I mentioned before, it took them 2 or 3 years, 2 to 3 years just to get a basic command of the language. So likely influence on anything that would have shown up in the census would have been very minimal. So I started in 1940, the 1940 census rather than 1930. And I took my study up to 1970 for several reasons. After 1970, SIL's own presence in Mexico continues to grow, but at a much slower clip. Secondly, there is a rapid increase in the federal educational initiatives, that is training and designation of bilingual teachers, and also in school building. School building has been growing really since the 1920s, but it really accelerates after 1970. So it becomes the question of what's driving literacy as of 1970, even in towns where SIL is present, is likely highly impacted by other factors, educational policy on behalf of the federal government. Road building, similarly, road building gathers pace as of the 1940s, but again, it really accelerates in the 1970s in rural eras, as does radio ownership. I think it's something like, I have the stats somewhere in my paper, I think something like by 1960, something like 28% of Mexican households had a radio, but by 1970, it was about 70%. So radio, again, is another driver of Spanish language acquisition, and therefore another variable that's hard to desegregate from the numbers concerning SIL communities where SIL was present. And finally, perhaps most importantly, Mexican Protestantism undergoes a sea change in around the 1960s, 1970s. It's hard to, I've not yet pinpointed when it really takes off. I'm talking about Pentecostalism. So Pentecostalism becomes the great driver. This is substantiated in a lot of these missionary accounts that I mentioned earlier. Memoirs about activities in Chiapas, for example, talk about Pentecostals coming into the community in the late 60s or early 70s, and their more effusive style of worship really draws in indigenous participants more quickly than Presbyterians have been able to do. So here's a chart, for example, from a study by an anthropologist focusing on Oaxaca, where you can see that the blue line is the growth, according to the censuses, the growth of Protestantism in Mexico, the percentage of adherents. Even quicker growth in Oaxaca. But the turning point is really, again, between the 1970 and 1980, you see a great acceleration in conversion, which seems to be largely attributable to Pentecostal activity. Sample selection. I decided that I needed to focus on towns where SIL was present for at least 20 years before or by 1970, so that enough of a period of time whereby their impact would be likely to show up in the census data. So minimum of 20 years, and for them to be present by 1950 at the latest. Some arrived in the late 1930s, some in the 1940s, but I chose 1950 as a cutoff point. And that produces something like 47 or so, perhaps slightly less, communities. 47 according to SIL's official data. I'm not entirely sure that 47 teams were actually in place by that year, but close to that number. And I chose to concentrate on those states that had at least 2 separate communities, 2 SIL municipios, as I call them, by 1950. Now, municipio is roughly the equivalent of a county. It's actually rather small. On average, it's rather smaller than a county. The average municipio is the size of what in England would be a county district, like West Oxfordshire. But this is how states are divided politically today. So you have a small county with a county town, a cabecera municipal in Spanish, and then outlying villages. And sometimes the missionaries, SIL decided to base itself in the county town and sometimes in an outlying pueblo. But either way, I assume, and this is backed up somewhat by the memoirs, that once they were established in any particular part of a given county, their educational efforts and their missionary efforts tended to have a spreading effect, tended to be transmitted through the rest of the county as people walked on a Sunday from another village to attend a service, or as people walked from another village to get medical attention because they heard that there were these gringo doctors who had, some magic potions who could cure this, that, and the other, or as they translated primers and other materials, as they produced textbooks, which were, as of 1951, used by secular educators too. Those would have been used in schools elsewhere in the county. So that's why I'm not too worried about whether SIL was based in the county town or an outlying village for the sake of this study. So I found 13, and when I say found, I couldn't simply go to one database and ask and see where SIL was present at a given time. I had to do a lot of toing and froing with the help of Sue Regnier in the Arizona archive of SIL. Their archive is ordered by names of missionaries, not by towns. So we had to do a lot of digging to find out who was where and when and for how long. And I have a whole Excel spreadsheet which has taken me a very long time to prepare in order to arrive at the data that's synthesized here in terms of numbers of teams in distinct states. So I look at 26, which is a slight majority of all SIL municipios, as I call them, by 1950. I'm going to skip over some more of the methodology. I'll just note here that I do take into account that census data is not always entirely reliable. Indigenous Mexicans sometimes lied to census takers about their ability to speak an indigenous language because it was not because they were embarrassed or because they preferred to present an image of buying into the modernizing project of the nation, and so they would want to sort of hide somewhat their indigenous identity. In poor rural areas, the census takers were often children. Frequently high school children, and in even poorer areas, primary school children were sometimes used. So how reliable were they as census takers? It's a question worth considering. And as of possibly fairly early on, an undercountering of Protestants, I've heard again anecdotally that if someone answered a census taker, answered the question, what's your religion? If they were to say Christian, they might well be written down as Catholic. A lot of Mexican Protestants refer to themselves as Christians. They don't say Protestantes, they say Cristiano or evangelical. So again, there's some gray area there. Were they correctly assigned their category in the census? And then in 1970, I see, as I'll show you later, what appears to be a deliberate attempt at statistical suppression. Okay, so let's get on to the data. First of all, religious conversion, and I'm looking at the three central Mexican states of Hidalgo, Puebla, and the state of Mexico. Mexico is the state that surrounds but does not include Mexico City. Here we see that in Hidalgo, the rate of religious conversion in the two communities where SIL was based was substantially greater than the rate of conversion on a statewide basis. It's particularly notable for the first 20 years, but persists in the in the third decade, between 1960 and 1970. Again, in Puebla, the difference is even more notable, the rate of conversion. So it's, as you can see there, by 1970, it's 239% for SIL based communities, as opposed to 134%, so almost double the rate of change. Now here's an example of what I would consider a statistical anomaly. The percentage of members of these counties where SIL is present who are Protestant in 1970 is actually less, slightly less than the percentage in 1960. Why is that? Is that because of persecution, a number of Protestants left their communities? Is it because Protestants tended to migrate either to cities like Mexico City or to the United States in greater numbers than Catholics? Or is this evidence of or a suggestion of undercounting? I'm not sure, but the numbers are worth some consideration. In the state of Mexico, massive increase in Protestant numbers, so much so that the percentages are almost not worth considering, because the base from which they started, 0 Protestants in the town of Jiquipilco in 1940. We can question whether that's reliable data, but 0 in the census, and by 20 years later, 5% of the county is Protestant. So a great impact in those two towns or counties in the state of Mexico. In Chiapas, the southernmost state of Chiapas, that state which is Mexico's most Protestant state today, in 1940, the Protestant presence was very similar to the national average, which the national figure was 0.91%, so very similar. But by 1970, the numbers in Chiapas are substantially higher than the national average, which is 3%, and in SIL communities, far, far higher, 12.8%. But again, we're seeing a diminution of the Protestant proportion in the average SIL community between 1960 and 1970. And it's quite a drop from almost 15% to almost 13%. And in particular towns, Oaxaca, for example, the county of Oaxaca, which sees a massive conversion in the 1950s. 1950, 0, that's actually a number we can question too, because Mariana Slocum's biography, memoir rather, talks about great numbers of converts in the 1940s, which is substantiated by anthropological accounts. So I think that 0 in 1950 is quite evidently a politicized lie. But you can see the drop-off from about 35% of the community in 1960 to only 25% in 1970. There's clearly a question to be asked there as to whether the census data is reliable, or whether there was some kind of mass exodus of persecuted Christians in the 1960s. From what I've read, I've not read any evidence of that, so I suspect that suppression of numbers is the main driver of that statistical change. Oaxaca, unfortunately, we can't talk about. For some reason, the censuses of 1960 and 1970 decided to group Oaxaca's many municipios. Oaxaca has more municipios than any other state. Even though it's not one of the most populous states, it's a very mountainous state and lots of highly fragmented communities. And I guess to save effort, the census authorities in 1960 and 1970 decided to group all the statistics into districts. District is a term that originated in the 19th century. After the Mexican Revolution, the districts were abandoned and municipios gained their autonomy. And so measurement was basically done in municipios, but not for Oaxaca in 1960, 1970. So we can't talk about conversion rates in SIL communities for the state of Oaxaca, unfortunately. And I've made inquiries with the statistical authorities in Mexico It turns out that the new head of the National Statistical Agency, INEGI, is an economic historian who I knew before she was appointed. And she very kindly looked into the matter, and she found that the original census data, which might reveal municipal level data on conversion, that all those papers were destroyed in the earthquake of 1985. Literacy, our second category. Here we see in, again, the central states of Hidalgo, Puebla, and the state of Mexico. Starting off with Hidalgo, we see a somewhat faster acquisition of literacy in SIL communities between 1940 and 1960. That accelerates between 1960 and 1970, double the rate of literacy acquisition compared to the rural average in that state. In Puebla, the numbers are disappointing, slightly lower than the rural average. However, if we take out the town of Zapotitlan, which, as you can see from the data, is an outlier, only 40% and then 28% increases in the decades we're looking at, compared to much higher levels in the first two towns. If we remove that outlier, it's also a much smaller town. So if we were to weight the data by population, which is something I need to do for all of these data before sending this paper off for publication, if we weight the data by population, we'll find that literacy acquisition in SIL communities is actually somewhat higher than the rural average in the state of Puebla too. And then in the state of Mexico, we see higher literacy acquisition in the first couple of decades, but then similar to the state average, the state's rural average during the 1960s, perhaps due to a more sustained school building effort in the state of Mexico. And that makes sense because it's a more urban state. In Oaxaca, again, we see slightly better results for literacy acquisition in SIL communities compared with the rural average. It's particularly notable actually in the 1960s. The difference becomes more notable in the 1960s, perhaps because SIL missionaries in Oaxaca had a steeper learning curve, but by the 1960s they were really able to drive literacy more successfully. And in Oaxaca, it's about the same for the state as a whole. About the same for the state as a whole, I'm sorry, in the first couple of decades, but again, in the between 1960 and 1970, we're seeing a faster rate of acquisition. It's also worth noting that in both Oaxaca and Chiapas, SIL tended to settle in the least literate communities. So you can see here, for example, in 1940, in the average SIL community, only 11% of the population is literate, as opposed to 15% for the state as a whole. So they had a harder task to begin with. I find correlation, I'm not doing regression analysis, but just basically looking at the numbers, I'm finding correlation in 3 of the 4 states. That is correlation between conversion and between literacy acquisition. I'm not including Oaxaca because we don't have county level data on religious affiliation, but for Hidalgo, the state of Mexico, and Oaxaca, we do see what appears to be a correlation. Again, one would have to go into qualitative analysis and a more extensive analysis of, for example, anthropological studies and memoirs, just to see exactly whether this was a causal relationship or a coincidence. But I think one can reasonably infer a degree of cause, not least because as converts take as indigenous people become Protestants, they want to read the Bible. So right there you have factor. Spanish language acquisition was something that I didn't actually go into in part, at least not in detail. I didn't crunch any numbers myself because I found a book written in the 1990s by an Oxford academic, Linda King, who had done a lot of the number crunching already and found that the data on Spanish language acquisition was quite was not entirely credible. Let's put it like this. So look at the column that says bilingual. Indian language speaking population, the percentage of bilingual indigenous people does not substantially shift between 1930 and 1990. There's some variation, a diminution by 1950, and then a slight increase between 1950 and 1960. This really flies in the face of all of the anthropological studies which show indigenous people learning Spanish. So, these data, I don't think we can attach much credence to them. What appears to be happening is that as indigenous people, many indigenous people who acquire Spanish represent themselves as Spanish speakers, no longer as indigenous speakers. So they're not included in the bilingual data. Actual bilingual figures, probably for each of those, probably for each of those decades would be higher than 10%. So for that reason, I decided it was not worth trying to crunch the numbers to see how much missionary activity was driving bilingualism. Besides which, the historical analyses that I've seen tend to argue that the greatest driver of bilingualism was road building, because with roads, indigenous people in small towns would more frequently go to market there to sell their wares. They would have to very often sell in using Spanish to sell to mestizos and white Mexicans, and so that was the real driver. Disposable income markers, and here I'm coming to the end of my presentation. Just a couple more charts to go. There are a number of proxies for economic or disposable income available in the censuses as of 1940. One of which is what people were wearing on their feet. Did they go barefoot? Did they wear huaraches, sandals, or did they wear shoes? I crunched the numbers for shoes on two of the counties that had the highest proportion of Protestants during the highest proportion of Protestant growth during the period that I'm looking at. And I did find that in SIL towns there was a higher than average adoption of the wearing of shoes. But we can't necessarily take that as an indicator of greater disposable income. It may be driven by greater disposable income in part, but it may also be driven by cultural factors such as the pastor's wearing a pair of shoes, so I better use what little money I have to buy a pair of shoes too, because it's a signal of modernity. Or the arrival of shoe shops. I'm not sure there are any data anywhere that are going to tell you when shoe shops arrived in particular towns. But again, it's a variable that would have impacted the acquisition of shoes, or traveling salesmen hawking shoes. So I present these data with a little bit of skepticism, but possibly disposable income originating in Protestant conversion had something to do with this. And then there are other disposable income markers that one can look at in the data too, such as the construction materials with which homes were built. Were they effectively shacks built of found materials? Did they have metal roofs? Were they adobe, or were they bricks and mortar? again, you would expect. And again, in the memoirs, there are accounts of converts using the disposable income that they gain from no longer spending on alcohol and Saints' Day festivals, etc., and using that to buy bricks and mortar to improve their homes. One might be able to go to the data and to go to the censuses and find evidence of that, but other variables will have come into play. So again, I'm a little skeptical. Finally, and this is the last chart, demographic change. I'm looking here at Chiapas because Chiapas is the state where the persecution of and eviction of Protestants from their homes, particularly in the 1960s, was most pronounced, or as of the 1960s, I should say. Famously in the town of Chamula. Chamula I didn't include in previous data, at least I don't think I did, because SIL was never physically present in Chamula. The way that SIL ministered to Chamula was to minister to Chamulans who came to San Cristobal, the main local city, to trade their wares or whatever, and that's where the evangelizing took place. And then Chamulans who converted would return to their community and evangelize among them. That's how Protestantism grew in Chamula. So I'm just checking to see if I do have other data. No, I don't. So yeah, I just included Chamula in this chart for this purpose to show the difference in numbers. So between 1950 and 1960, you have a fairly substantial. I'm sorry, between 1960 and 1970, the population of Chamula only grows by 9.5%, whereas the rural average growth for that decade is almost 30%. Why is it growing at a much smaller rate? Well, because a lot of people are leaving. Presumably that's also happening in Tumbala, which is the next village up. You can see that there's no population growth at all, less than 1% between 1960 and 1970. How is that possible? Well, it may well be a sign of religious persecution, and there's some evidence of that in the anthropological literature and the memoirs. So I think I've spoken for 55 minutes or slightly more. So I'll leave it at that, and just post my findings once again with my contact for anyone who wants to get in touch. And I welcome your questions and comments.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and excellent presentation. Everybody who's attending, if you look down the bottom bar on the far right, there is a button called reactions. And if you push on reactions, and then you could raise your hand and I will call on you, and then you can unmute and make a comment or ask a question of Andrew. And I'll turn first to David Singh. I see the hand up.
Oh, yes, thank you very much for this excellent lecture. I'm asking a question because there's a piece of research that I'm going to get into, and that is going to involve me having to learn a new methodology, and part of what you've done really is or will be a very good source for me to learn how to do my own research, really. And I think your conclusions from the particular Mexican case that you presented are fairly well borne out also by the evidence I see from other contexts, from places in Southeast Asia, for example, or in South Asia where I come from. Mm-hmm. And so I was looking particularly at Nicholas Tapp's work, which was published in the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies. I don't know if you've seen that.
I'm sorry, what was the last name?
Nicholas Tapp, T-A-P-P.
Okay.
And it shows that literacy, is a very strong motivating factor in people's choice to convert to Christianity. Mm. And he particularly focuses on the Hmong people from Southeast Asia.
Right.
But I also know from my own context in South Asia, and particularly through the work of Jonathan Ingleby, who did his PhD here in OCMS many years ago, that Christianity does impact not just literacy, but educational levels among those who choose to convert to Christianity. But there is a very big puzzle, as it were, and I'm saying this based on Pew Research. So if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, both the indigenous people are converting both to Christianity and Islam in roughly equal numbers. And yet there is a huge attainment gap. So that is to say that those who convert to Christianity tend to be better educated over a period of time than those who choose to convert to Islam. So I don't know exactly what is going on. I think it is very likely that those who convert to Islam see Islam as a source of religious teaching more than more broad level teaching of science and mathematics and other languages, and perhaps that's one reason why there is this gap. I don't know. Do you have any idea why there is this gap?
Well, I would suspect because to read the Quran, one has to read it in Arabic. I mean, one doesn't have to, but obviously there are versions of the Quran in many languages. But it may be that the kind of Islam that's being taught encourages, rather like the Catholic Church did for centuries in Latin America, encourages converts to view clergy as mediators, and rather than engaging directly with the texts themselves.
Yeah, but this is really not a question for you, but I basically wanted to say what I said in order to support the work you've done and commend you for an excellent piece of work you've done.
Thank you very much. I will look into the Tab and Engleby work. Thank you.
Okay, let's go with Ian. Go ahead and unmute, Ian.
And yes, it's always better to unmute, isn't it? Thank you, Andrew, very much indeed. As an SAL person, as you can see, and particularly as a literacy person, I'm most interested in what you found.
Thank you.
Just a very simple, straightforward question to start with, though. How was literacy defined? How was literacy defined for the purposes of your study, or how was literacy assessed and counted?
That's a very good question. My understanding is that for the decades that I'm looking at, census takers would simply ask, "Are you literate?"
Okay. Yeah.
Can you? It might have been. They might, in some cases, have been asked to write their name or sign the form after the questions have been asked, which would thereby be evidence. I should know this, and I might even have it in a footnote in the paper. But yes, the assessment was not rigorous.
No, but at least even if it's self-reporting, there's a degree of consistency from one census to another.
Right. And the census does not distinguish between literacy in an indigenous language or literacy in Spanish. It's simply, are you literate?
No. Just following on from the previous contribution, I did a bit of research for my own PhD in Cameroon, where I'm much more familiar with Africa than Latin America. And it was interesting to see the difference in the attitude of people to literacy and education according to which denomination they were attached to. And so the Baptists that I interviewed were very committed to literacy for the purpose of reading the Bible, whereas the Catholics whom I interviewed were very keen on seeing literacy not so much for scriptural purposes and spiritual development, but much more for education and material development in the broad sense of the word.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to see the denominational differences that you find even within churches. But I just make that.
Yes, that squares with Mexico too.
Good. Okay. Thank you. It's good to know that. Thank you, Andrew, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And thank you, Andrew. It's interesting. I'll follow on from Ian a little bit. This helps explain a little bit of why, when I was in Singapore, one of our congregation members who was with the embassy in Mexico and an official there was Presbyterian. And I always found that fascinating. He was probably touched by Presbyterian translators down there. But here's my question. It's very interesting that the materials that were going out to the people in part of the translation had so much to do with citizenship and other factors. And has there been any kind of studies to look at how people move from subjects to the self-perception of citizens, and how you would measure that in terms of schools, activities, that sort of thing, in terms of being active agents and seeing themselves as agents rather than just subjects to higher authorities within the worlds they're growing up in?
Well, there is a whole field of research within history on citizenship. The work I'm more familiar with is more about the 19th century than the 20th. So I'm not sure how to answer that question. It's a very good question, and a field for further study. But other than, I was going to say that one area one could look at is elections, but elections in Mexico until very recently were long marked by the tradition of acarreo, which is basically the bringing in mass transit of voters to the voting booth, transit organized by the ruling party. Mexico, for those of you who are not familiar with the country, was ruled by the same party for 71 years, from 1929 to 2000. And it's the way it perpetuated itself in power, in part, was by rigging elections. And one of the tools they used was this acarreo, this physical, bringing by car or truck of voters to voting booths, with the promise of a free lunch or a free T-shirt or both. And the expectation that they would all vote for the ruling party. And it's that kind of full house voting pattern that I see in some of the religious affiliation data on Chiapas. I suspect that some of the towns where 0 Protestants were registered, the county where Mariana Slocum was based, for example, still in 1950, 0 Protestants. That, to me, sounds like a kind of a religious version of the political electioneering mechanism whereby everyone in a particular town or county was registered as voting for the PRI, because that's what everyone did and that's what the politicians expected. Citizenship study of citizenship in Mexico in recent decades has been tied very much to the study of civil society and people getting together in groups to pursue a social agenda or justice without having to rely on, or without wanting to rely on the government. But we really see that taking off in the 1980s. There's not much evidence of it beforehand.
Only one other question on similar lines. Has there been any charting of the rise of schools and formal instruction with literacy rates rising?
The scholarship on Mexican education is not strong post 1940. Historians have done a lot of work on the late 19th century and the first 4 decades of the 20th, but post 1940 there's not much. Now, Bob Woodbury, who I mentioned at Baylor, tells me that he's doing a lot of work to try and find out where when schools were built in each municipio, in each county across Mexico. So to be able to give a better sense of how much SIL and how much other factors are driving literacy levels. But yeah, there's very little work on that.
Good. Do we have any other questions or comments, or we can bring the lecture to a close? I do not see any other hands. Andrew, thank you so much for a fascinating, absolutely excellent lecture. I think too, very helpful for both our faculty and students to see how quantitative data helps us to get a better glimpse on what's going on there, and in mission and in the impact of mission. So deeply appreciated.
Tom, I think Mark Schwab had a question.
Oh yes, yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
No, I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, and I've got another hand up. Now we have Oluwadera.
Yes. I want to also say thank you to Andrew. I really listened and enjoyed his presentation, especially his methodologies and how he was able to put together his findings. For me too, that will definitely help my research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I should perhaps have mentioned that while the data on SIL's presence in Mexico and when teams were arriving at particular places was hard and very time consuming to find, and I did it through a combination of correspondence with Arizona and also looking at the footnotes of those academic studies that were published in the 40s and 50s. There would typically be an initial footnote where the writer, let's say it's an essay on I don't know, phonemes in a particular dialect of Mixtec, and there'll be a footnote saying that the field work for this paper was conducted in this particular place between this particular years. And so bingo, there I have this SIL missionary in this town as of this particular year. So but that took a lot of digging. That took a lot of downloading of articles from JSTOR and other places, and reading the introductions to lots of essays. That said, the census data, and I don't know if this would also be true of Cameroon and India and other places that some of you are studying, but in Mexico at least, the census data are all available online. The national, the INEGI, the National Statistical Institute in Mexico, has done a very good job of making all this data available in PDF form online. So that was a big time saver, not having to physically go into the archives to do that.
Andrew, one more came up. You noted several times in your lecture there was a point of time when it seems that people were consciously jiggering the numbers.
Yeah.
What were the motivations for that? And was that part of the people answering the questions, or was that official changing of numbers for political reasons?
Well, I suspect the latter. I suspect that what was happening in Chiapas, where it's most noticeable, is that Protestant conversion was rising at a faster clip than anywhere else in Mexico. Mm. And the local Catholic authorities, I suspect, following the rhetoric that was coming out of Mexico City and elsewhere, were anxious to stem the tide of Protestantism. And whether by direct communication with census authorities or whether census authorities simply sort of imbibed the rhetoric indirectly, what I am inferring from the data is a concerted attempt to downplay numbers. Now, one piece of evidence is that in the options that you had for answering the question of affiliation, religious affiliation. The options were basically Catholic, Protestant, other, or none. And the none category for Chiapas explodes in 1970. It goes from about 1% to 10%. So I suspect that, that if someone said that a lot of people who answered, for example, I'm Presbyterian, or I'm Reformist, or I'm something else, the census taker would have put none because they didn't understand the answer. So I suspect that a large chunk, a majority of the nuns were actually Protestants. So right there you have, now that's not necessarily a top-down instruction, but it could be. You know, if they don't say either, you know, Catholic, Protestant, or if they don't say Catholic or Protestant, then put them in the nun column. But one would need to do some digging. One would need to go into each, the statistical authority has an office in each of the states. So one would need, you know, permission to go into the Chiapas office, which is, I think, in Tuxtla Gutierrez, and, you know, dig in their files to look at correspondence from the 1970 census and see, you know, what, you know, if there was any communication, for example, between Catholic authorities and statistical and census supervisors.
Yeah,
there might be something there. And the head of the authority, the current head of the statistical authority, has said that she will, if I want to go to Chiapas, she'll get me in there. So it's one of the pending assignments that I have.
that sounds good. One of the, I lived in Singapore for 11 years, and various sociologists, especially Western sociologists, commented that the actual counted numbers of Christians in censuses was often jiggered down by the government, often with sympathy from the Christians, because they were concerned about inter-religious violence in the city, and so the sense was to downplay Christian numbers, so people wouldn't think that they're kind of taking over and having too much influence over the government. But it was Western sociologists that brought this to light, and also didn't make them very popular with the government, but it was an active move to depress numbers for political expediency. But
that's very interesting. If there's anything been written on that, I'd be very interested to see it.
I'll have to go back and look at it, because it was, gosh, I was doing the research and came across it about, oh no, 15, 16 years ago, but I'll see if I can pull it up. Anyway, with that, we will bid adieu to Andrew. Fascinating lecture again, and thank you so much. Again, this lecture, if anyone knows anyone who would like to hear this on YouTube, we have a YouTube account, and they can go to the site to find that, and that is found on our website. So with that, thank you, Andrew, and we will bid adieu.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much to you all.